Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Kojeve. We're reading Kojeve, right? Today we are looking at the third part, part three in the phenomenological access. Remember, part one. The structure of the book is divided into two parts: analysis and A and B, deductions, and then in inductions is part one is phenomenological access, number two Roman noodle is metaphysicals, and then ontological. Right, we're still in the analysis. We're in the phenomenological, and in the phenomenological, but there's like three parts: part one, part two, part three. Okay, this is the longest part of the book in that sense. Um, 7 to 48 in the pages. Today we're going to be looking at uh, pages 28 to 48 in that sense in this booklet, which deals with number three. So let's go look through it. Okay, let's go through it. So okay, 3A. First A. We have therefore arrived at the following result: with the four irresistible types of human authority: father, cause, right? Master, risk; um, leader, projection, prediction, right? Judge, equity, justice. So this is like the reason. This is the kind of logic of why it is, right? This is the name, and this is the kind of thing. It's the father is the cause, the master is there's a risk involved, the leader, project and projection, and then judges the equity and justice, right? To each of these types correspond a theory. Father is scholastic, or that master Hegel, leader Aristotle, judge Plato. As a matter of fact, the concrete cases of real authority are always complex. All four pure types are combined in them. But as we nevertheless distinguish them on the basis of the predominant one or several of these pure types, a person can be mostly leader or mostly judge, and so on. Predominance means either that the authority of the determinate kind is comparatively greater than the degree of authority in the other ones. We react less so when so and so acts in his capacity as leader than when he acts as his capacity of judge, for example, or that authority of a determinate kind provided the basis for the authority as another kind of authority. For example, we do not react against judgments of so and so because he has the authority, the capacity as leader, or on the contrary, we do not react against his projects. React against his projects because he has authority as his capacity of judge. Note, it seems, moreover, that an authority that provides the basis for another one, thereby has greater prominence. So authority that gives the basis for other thing has the authority that provides the basis for another authority has the greater predominance. We can, moreover, establish a hierarchy of the dominant types of authority where there is more than one, for example, that of the predominance of the leader and the judge types, when we can distinguish the case where leader prevails over judge, and from where the judge prevails over the leader. So this idea, we can understand which one prevails, and this, if a combination of this is both that when does the leader prevail over the judge, and what does the judge prevail over the leader, right? Supposing that this is the case, we can draw up a comprehensive list of all the possible types of authority. In that way, we get the following: four pure types: F, L, M, and J. So father, uh, um, leader, master, judge, right? Six combinations of two pure types: master, leader, no, father, leader, father, master, father, judge, father, master, leader, master, and so on. So what are the four types? Would be FL, FM, FJ, LM, LJ, MJ, right? That's so six combinations, right? With two variants of each, L, LF, and LFL. So therefore, the switch is the switch. That is 12 types. So six combinations, but the variants can switch. So therefore, if FL, then LF. So uh, uh, we just go through those six things. There's 12 types. There are, yeah, wait a minute. There's more than 12. Let me see. Yeah, dun dun dun. FL. Yeah, it's 4 times 4. How do you get 12? He gets this four combinations with two variants of each, right? So there's, okay, I can see what he's saying. There's two variations, and then there's the switch of them, right? Of each one of them. So therefore, there's like, um, um, let's just do the math here. One, two, three. So the L, M, L, J, and then J, L. So three more. One, two, three, four. No, there's more. Not L, M, L, M, L, J, and M, J. Okay, two more things like that, right? Okay, and then each one flips around. And then each one is flipped, so 12 types. Okay. Of the four combinations of three types with six variants, that is 24 types. So, so of the three types and the six variations, wow, with six variations, and therefore 24 types, and then one type of four types with 24 variations, and so on. Whew, very complex model, right? This is a four pure types. There are six, three things, and four. Okay, with 24 variations. Oh God, this is a very complex model here. Thus, we end up in total with 64 types of authority, four pure types, and 60 compounds. With 64 types of authority, four pure types, and 64 compounds, or 15, four pure, or 15, four pure and 11 compounds. If variants are not taken into consideration, if our theory is accurate, this list exhausts all possibilities. It would be a matter of verifying whether all of them are realized or realizable. In each concrete case, um, we would see to which pure or compound type it belongs. We would need to determine what all these conditions, combinations mean, and would have to draw all the consequences from their meaning. Of course, it is out of the question to undertake here the work of a comprehensive phenomenological analysis. Okay, so we're not going to do again. This repeat. I'm not going to do this. In other words, he's not going to go into this. This would be a book. This would be an endless book. But he sets up that this is the kind of phenomenology, the phenomenology of a big, the found groundwork of a great big work. We shall only say that total authority, which encompasses all pure types, must be carefully distinguished from selective authority, which integrate only one or two or three of these types. This is because it is very important to know to which sphere a given authority extends, in order to know that it is able to be what it is, and be able to say accordingly what must be done in order to determine the best way to establish, exercise, and keep and transmit this authority. To be sure, as we have already said, every real authority is in fact more or less total. In other words, by granting someone the authority of one of the four pure types, that of leader, for example, we are obviously compelled also to grant him the authority of the other three types as derivative authorities. Similarly, every holder of a selective authority has a natural tendency to transform it into a total authority. On the other hand, observation of complete absence of one or several pure types of authority generally induces the cancellation of the existing types. For instance, observing that a leader is hopeless as a judge, or even unjust, we tend to no longer recognize this authority as leader. The existence of selective authorities is beyond doubt. In other words, the relative absence of pure authority types does not actually cancel the authority of another type, it only weakens it. This leads us to distinguish absolute authority from relative alternatives. We can talk about absolute authority where none of the acts of its possessor induces reaction. As for relative authorities, they can be classified according to the relative greatness, that is to say, the relationship between the number of all acts and the number of acts that do not induce any reaction, even if only in guise of doubt or discussion. So reaction, even if only in do not in reaction, even if only in guise of doubt or discussion. Obviously, absolute authority in the strongest sense of the word is never realized in fact. Only God is held to possess it, or more precisely, God should have possessed it. And it is also obvious that an absolute authority can only be total. That, but it is possible to say that total authority. But is it possible to say that total authority is necessary absolute? And generally speaking, is it possible to establish an a priori theoretical relation between one type of pure or complex authority and its scope, its relative greatness? For example, is it possible to say that in principle, in the case of the leader, of the authorities leader plus judge, the variant leader judge represents an authority relatively greater than which corresponds to the variant judge leader? One has more authority, which has greater authority than that. Undoubtedly, the study of these questions is extremely interesting, both theoretically and practically, in politics, for example. Right? But we can neither carry out such a study nor even initiate it here. No. It is a study of this kind that will allow us to resolve in the definite fashion the problem, in other words, the problem of the separation of powers and that of the Constitution, as well as the structure of the state in general. See below B and then section 1. Right? So therefore, in other words, that study of this kind, of this trying to understand all these things, will allow us to resolve the problem of separation of powers and that of the Constitution. B, likewise, we can touch only lightly on another problem, which is obviously related to the phenomena of analysis of authority, namely of the genesis and transmission of authority. So therefore, we can touch lightly on another problem, that is the genesis and transmission of authority. In terms of its genesis, authority can be either spontaneous or conditioned. It can be, in the first case, it can spontaneously generated by the fact emanating from the person possessing it. without presupposing any outward act or departing from the preliminary existence of any other given authority. In the case of a conditioned authority, it comes into being following acts others than those of its predecessor, and generally presupposes the existence of another authority on which it depends. The study of the conditioned birth, the study of the conditioned birth authority, therefore leads to the study of the transmission of authority. So therefore, the study of the conditioned birth of authority leads to the study of how authority is transmitted. All four types of pure authority are assumed to have a spontaneous origin or genesis. It is personal risk that engenders the authority of the master. There's no need whatsoever for any other authority to predate it. We can easily think of the appearance of the first masters of the earth. Therefore, the existence of the authority of the leader, the judge, or even the father. But we can equally suppose that the first authority was that of the leader. The personal act of the first man proposing the first project was able to establish his authority at an epoch when there was not, generally speaking, any authority yet. When we can also accept the fable of Herodotus cited above, according to which the first authority was that of judge, spontaneously engendered by personal exercise of justice by a single individual. As for the authority of the father, there would seem to be no grounds to speak of a spontaneous generation because an individual does nothing to obtain it. In fact, however, this does not this case does not differ from the preceding ones in the broad sense of the word. Something needs to be done to obtain authority of the father, namely, one needs to become a father, or in the derivative case, reach more or less advanced age. Right? The only difference is that in this case, all men are, in principle, able to do what it takes to achieve the authority of the Father, because all that one has to do is live long enough, which is still not true for everyone. While in the three other cases of authority, what is involved is an action in the narrow sense of the term. Personal acts that require some special talent that cannot be found in anyone. This is in any case, one can easily imagine the emergence of the first father, invested with the corresponding authority, at an epoch where no other authority yet rests. And it is indeed the father himself who engenders the authority that he enjoys. By contrast, in the case of conditional origins, in the case of condition, origin must be distinguished from the cases of spontaneous ones. According to the social contract thesis, for example, the first political authority has its origin in a collective decision. That is to say, an act not of the person who will exercise authority, but those who will be subject to it. Authority is therefore conditioned here by someone other than itself, by acts other than those of the person who will embody it. And the same applies when the man who has to embody authority is randomly chosen in the sense of drawing lots, or designated by something which has nothing to do with his own acts, merits, or his personality in general, as the case of the Dalai Lama, for instance. Right? So, but we can ask ourselves if there is truly in such cases a genesis of authority. It seems, on the contrary, that we are dealing with the transmission of authority, the emergence of the new authority being conditioned by the preliminary existence of another authority. Okay, so therefore, the social contract, even in the eyes of its partisans, has not been anything other than a working hypothesis. Okay, this is that they have never maintained that this is how authority actually comes into being. Okay? I'm not sure. Okay, that's an interesting argument. This is one argument, is that even then is partisan as only a working hypothesis. We have never maintained this is how authority is becoming. According to this analysis, every authority is either that of the father, the leader, the master, or the judge. That is a combination of these pure authorities. But we have seen here that one of the pure authorities is capable of engendering itself spontaneously, that is, by contrast. Inconceivably, that one of them is engendered for the first time as a result of a social contract or a drawing of lots or any such other act. Because it's by this content, and by contrast, inconceivable that one of these can be engendered by a result of a social contract, of drawing by lots or any such act. As for the known concrete cases of condition genesis, none of these turned out to be a genuine genesis. On the one hand, there is, generally speaking, the authority recognized, that is to say, already existing, intervention of divine authority beforehand, destiny, and so on, does 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 nothing other than nominate God's elected one to transmit his authority. On the other hand, it is never questioned. It is never a question of the birth of a new authority. Authority itself is already here. That is to say, it is already recognized. It is only a question of changing the material human support by transferring it from one individual or group to another. So that here too, the question of transmission, it is a question of transmission of authority, not of genesis of it. So I'm not creating something new, it's transmission. So you have to distinguish between, let's say, a genesis and a transmission. That a genesis is a new authority, creating of a new authority. But here, that it's not usually that of a new authority. In other words, something spontaneous cannot be engendered, right? That these things are spontaneous. But then, if it's something engendered for the first time as a result of a social contract, it's inconceivable. So the condition genesis, known cases for this, none of these turn out to be real genesis, he says, that they're transmissions of authority. We can therefore say that every genuine genesis of authority is necessary spontaneous, and that there is a particular or pure or compound type of genesis corresponding to each pure or compound authority. So a genesis is spontaneous. Or for the so-called conditional genesis, that they're nothing other than the cases of transmissions. As for the sake of condition genesis, these are transmissions. And it is to the problem of such transition of authority that we must turn our attention. So, note 1. The birth, genesis of authority must not be confused with the eternal science of its recognition. It is true that authority exists only insofar as it's recognized. The master is master of his slave only insofar as the latter recognizes him as such, or recognizes himself as a slave, and so on. It is therefore possible to say that the genesis of authority is the genesis of genesis of its recognition by those who will be subject to it. But it is possible precisely for this reason, because it boils down to the same thing, to say that authority itself, that authority makes itself known to those who are subject to it. Either there is no authority at all, or it is recognized by the fact that it of its existence. Okay, so there's no authority of its own. If I recognizing it, I make it. Therefore, that it's there. In other words, recognition does not make the thing. Recognize discovers that what's there. Right. Authority and recognition of authority are one and the same thing. It is possible, however, to distinguish between this recognition of authority a rendition of authority itself, and what could be called manifestation. And if and this manifestation is not only an external sign of respect and so on, but also an external form of the act of recognition itself. For example, in an assembly, someone proposes a project and is accordingly elected leader. It is his project that has engendered his authority as leader, and not his election by others. He does not hold authority because he had been elected. He has been elected because he has already been granted the advantage derived from the authority generated by his project. The election was nothing but the manifestation or external sign of his authority, engendered spontaneously, that is to say, by active recognition of his authority. Generally speaking, authority and its recognition arises spontaneously, and the candidate who will be elected before his election will be, which is nothing but the first manifestation of this already existing, that is to say, recognized authority. So, similarly, non-election of a candidate does nothing but manifest his lack of authority. So that's note one is a very interesting thing. Note here in this sense, this is the question of the authority of this thing, and that even how democratic election of this, the selection of this, right, the genesis of this, right. This is that very the question of genesis, right, and the difference between genesis and external versus external things, and the difference between that and recognition of the authority. Now let's go to note two. Note two, the democratic theory of the social contract arises from an erroneous interpretation of the fact of the existence of political elections, existence of political or other elections. On the one hand, this theory does not see that, just as we have said, elections confirm rather than engender authority. That is to say, it simply makes the external manifest, it makes it externally manifest, as is the case in every other act of obedience. That is the renunciation of reacting. On the other hand, this theory overlooks the fact that the known cases of election pertain to men and not to principles. An election transmits an already existing, that is to say, recognized authority from one individual group to another, but it never creates an authority that has not existed before anywhere else. So in other words, it either transmits authority or recognizes authority that exists. It doesn't create an election. An election does not create. In addition, analysis of this theory shows that it has in mind a, a case of transmission of authority. It assumes, in fact, that in and by the act of election, authority passes from the electorate to the elected person or persons, the former parting their authority, i.e., power, in favor of the elected. And it is only effectively in this way that this theory can be justified, by providing this corrective to it. Because if there had not been any exercising authority, the election would never have been never had been able to engender it. There would be, for that matter, no election, because there could be no one elected. Why one rather than the other, unless the authority already exists, right? And if it is chance that decides, why would the elected have authority unless chance is divine authority? By contrast, if I have authority, the person I elect has it too. See below. Right? See this, the next below thing, right? So, okay. Democratic one is very interesting. A theory of the social contract. So he makes the argument that it's really the authority, the people themselves have the authority. Each individual has the authority inside them, and that they give that by electing that person, they transfer to that thing to them. Right? That's the whole point, right? Okay, that's the interesting thing. That this is how we would understand Hobbes and Locke in that regard. But what is this authority that is transmitted by election? Quite obviously, and by definition, one cannot have authority over oneself. The very the very idea of a reaction having no meaning at all here. Also, the fact that I, an isolated individual, have elected someone does not give the elected any authority over me, rather than the other way around, unless there were an authority that I recognized, independent of the fact of my election. So therefore, election implies if I was giving them the power, then I'm the power holder. Okay, and I don't have power over my. I don't have authority over myself. So I'm not giving him authority, and therefore I'm giving authority. That means I'm the authority. No, it doesn't work this way. It is I'm just recognizing authority. I'm just merely recognizing authority that is there. So we speak correctly of collective rather than individual election. But here, the notion of authority have a meaning because we can distinguish in a group the whole from the components of this whole, and one component from another, and or from all the others, and we can speak of the authority of the whole over the components, or of one component over another, or of others, particularly the authority of the majority over the minority, or the minority over the majority. The election does nothing other than to transmit an already existing, that is to say, recognized authority over the elected. This entire question, therefore, comes down to knowing whether this authority is sui generis authority. Is it true in itself? Is it distinct from the authorities of the father, the leader, the master, and the judge, and their compounds that we have distinguished and described? But this is what the theory of social contract maintains, when speaking generally of the sui generis authority of the majority has over the minority. We must therefore see whether this theory is accurate. If it is accurate, our theory is wrong. If our theory is true, the theory in question must be reducible to either to one of our pure types, or to one among the other combinations. We have no interest in cases where one part of the group exerts over the others an authority of a known type, whether it's collective or individual. This does not change anything, either in the nature or the mode of its genesis. A group can embody the authority of the leader, for example, in the same way that of an individual. It is a question of knowing whether there is a sui generis authority that pertains to part of the groups in so much as it is a part only. But this question can only be founded on the qualitative value of the group. The qualitative value is indeed nothing other than that of the father, the leader, the master, or the judge, leading us back to the already studied cases. Since we do not distinguish between cases and individuals and collective authority while speaking about these types of authority. In other words, this qualitative issue leads us back to the father, the judge, these qualities, the qualitative character. That is, remember, we go back all the way to that thing, is that I created it. I risk something, master. The leader is I predict, or I propose something, I predict something, right? Does that go back all the way? Let's go back. Dun, all the way back here, right? Risk, cause, project, prediction, equity, just, right? It is only this to be found on the found qualitative value of the group. The qualitative value is indeed nothing other than that of the, we said these qualities, leading us back to the already study cases, which we did not distinguish between the collective point of view of or collective authority while speaking of these things. However, from a qualitative point of view, the part which exerts an authority over another can either be equal to it, form the majority, or form the minority. So I can be either equal, or I'm better than it, I'm a majority of it, or the minority, right? If both parts are equal, there is obviously no reason for one to for one of them to exert qua part an authority over the other. If it does so, it is because there are qualitative reasons or qualities of the leader, the judge, or so on. By contrast, the principle of the majority can exert authority over a minority only because it is a majority. Similarly, a minority can do the same uh, 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 qua part. That is to say, by the mere fact that being a minority. Theories of total social contract, democratic theories, generally maintain, but not always, see Rousseau, that there is a sui generis authority of the majority qua majority. That it is possible to say that it is this sui generis authority that is transmitted by election to the elected. So again, I think this is where Rousseau. This is where he, but not always. This is see Rousseau. There is not this authority of the majority in that sense, right? In fact, however, it is possible to speak of the authority of the majority. It is possible. It is if it is possible to speak of the authority of the majority, it is equally possible to speak of the authority of the minority. The former certainly seems to be more obvious. Be obvious. The former certainly seems to be more obvious. Cases where we consciously or voluntarily submit to acts of the majority solely because it's the majority are readily observable. But there is well-known variant of authority, the authority of public opinion, of what would people say, the desire to pass unnoticed, to do the same as everyone else does, and so on. But the opposite case must not be overlooked either, that there can be called the authority of the authentic over the banal, that is also a pejorative nuance attached to the word of the masses, the crowd, the hoi polloi, Joe public, and so on. There is also the universal widespread phenomenon called snobbery. The snob is someone who imagines himself to be authentic, personal, and so on, but who is in fact the slave of an authority, no less than the petty bourgeoisie of of what what would people say, of the authority of what the people would say. It is simply that he does not recognize any authority other than that which he believes to be the elite by tacitly supposing that this is necessarily only a minority. He would therefore be tempting to say that there are cases, snobbery for instance, where the minority exerts sui generis authority by dint of the fact that by being a minority, as there are similarly the prod de whom, for example. Okay, prod de whom. Let's look at this. The member of the elected industrial tribunal, right? The prod de whom, for example, where the majority exerts where the majority exerts an authority qua majority. So there are similar cases where the example where the majority uh, 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 exerts authority qua majority. Let us see whether in this case we are dealing with cases of sui generis authority or whether they can be interpreted or combined of our pure types. We shall first take the case of the majority, accepting, of course, that its authority derives solely from the fact that it is a majority. However, since authority cannot be exercised over oneself, it makes no sense to speak of the authority of the majority over itself, that is to say, over its members, since by definition the majority is a quality, that is to say, the sum total of its members. As for the minority, its very existence proves that it does not recognize the authority of the majority, since forming a minority means precisely being opposed to the majority, or reacting in one way or another against its acts. But where there's no authority, reactions can be only removed by force. Therefore, wherever the majority claims sui generis would be authority resulting from its sheer numbers, it is in fact claiming pure and simple force. So let me stop here. This idea he's saying that minority, they're going to resent it, that the factional conflict and its only way to resolve this is force, and therefore there's no authority in this situation. Anywhere there's force, he says there's no authority. For authority is I have the possibility, but I renounce it. The minority would not renounce it unless the minority renounces it. The minority is defined not by its resistance, but by what it is, right? There is no authority. Reactions can only be removed by force. Therefore, wherever the majority claims sui generis would be authority resulting from the sheer numbers, it is in fact claiming pure and simple force. A regime that is based purely and solely on the majority is a regime founded on force only. The majority regime can therefore be contrasted with the authoritarian one, and the latter one rests on authority, while the former rests on. Now this is very true. The majority government, democratic government, resting on majority is forceful. We're an authoritarian government. Okay, this is playing abuse based on authority. The authoritarian government is not based on this. There's an irony here. There's something funny going on here. Authoritarian government usually is based on coercion, right? Because there's resentment towards it. In other words, but he makes the argument there can be no force on authority. Therefore, by definition, the majority would. What happens in the case of the minority is just a minority because of what the group is. Okay, and that as long as they are the minority and as they will accept the authority of the majority, then there's not a contestation of this. They accept what the majority does. That's authority. That's democratic authority in that sense, right? The system works as when the majority rules like this. Now, the case of a minority, the minority exercising power, but it would have to exercise power by other means, not based on itself, but some other claim, right? So that's the other thing about this. So, okay, that's the point there. No, given that if the qualitatively equal, if qualitatively equal, the majority is necessarily stronger than the minority. The minority, generally speaking, knows this and consciously renounces any reaction that is a priori doomed to failure. And it is for this reason that the majority does not generally need to deploy force or use violence. Okay, therefore, what is it? That it is the stronger power. It is the stronger. And is doomed to failure. Any action is doomed to failure. And that for this reason, the majority does not need to deploy actual force or use violence. The conscious renunciation or reaction produces the same effect as, at the same time, the illusion of a sui generis authority of the mass majority. So therefore, it's the master, right? In other words, here he says that, generally speaking, conscience renounces any reaction as an a priori doomed to failure. And it's for this reason that the majority does not generally deploy force force and violence. The conscious renunciation or reaction produced by at the same time the illusion of a true generous authority over the master majority. But this is only illusion because the conscious renunciation cannot be described as voluntary. Okay, it's not voluntary. Why? Generally speaking, the strong can almost always prevail against. The strong can almost always prevail without effective employing force. Threat alone being generously enough to induce renunciation of any attempt to react. But such renunciation of reaction has nothing to do with the recognition of authority. If a boxing champion tells me to leave the cafe, I do it. I do it without reacting, but certainly not because he has any authority in my eyes. But wait a minute. Again, this leads us to the point about the other thing. This is why I would argue. This is why love and fear does not have this. So the master is not master. Isn't master also fear? Doesn't his understanding of maybe not in Hegel, but in Aristotle it is. The master, in one sense, the power. There is the argument about power. No, Plato would have this. Plato accepts that power does matter in justice. Um, it's not the whole of justice, right? But remember my point about love and love. This is why love and fear is not that. Fear cannot be the basis of this because a threat is that cannot be the basis of authority. If I'm doing anything out of fear, then that's no reason. Well, that just throws the hell out of Hobbes' social contract, then, in that sense, right? Therefore, there is no sui generis authority proper to a majority by dint of the fact that it's mere majority. The same applies to the minority. Surely true, since that the minority is necessarily weaker physically, so to say quantitatively, than the majority. Its power can only derive from its authority. Minority regimes are necessarily authoritarian, but this authority never derives from the fact that the minority is a minority. The justification propaganda is always of a kind, even though we are the only minority. We, blah, blah, blah. The authority that is endorsed by the minority justifies itself or explains itself by quality, not by quantity. Even a snob claims to belong to the elite and not to a minority. This means that there's no sui generis authority of the minority. And analysis of concrete cases shows that the minority always claims either authority of the father, the leader, the judge, master, the judge, or their combinations. In short, the fact being in the minority or majority can never, it's by itself, engenders authority. The authority of the minority or the authority is either illusionary, simple force, or it belongs to one of the types mentioned above or their combinations. This said, authority could, as a matter of fact, belong to the minority as much as the majority. But the theory of the social contract does not necessarily have the character of a majority-based theory. We can even say that the variant that wrongly assumes the existence of a sui generis authority of majority over the minority is nothing but a distortion of the original theory, see Verso, which maintains more or less consciously the existence of this sui generis authority of the whole over the part. Thus, for Rousseau, the authority of the whole or of the general will is not necessarily expressed by the majority. And in some cases, it can be even contrary to the sum of all particular wills. Again, see the social contract. The existence of a general will opposed to a private will. There are some independently from the question of number is indisputable. This fact has always existed, and Rousseau's only enormous merit was to have brought it to light. Rousseau's general will what we can call the authority of the whole over the parts, is what used to be called the reason to stop, or so on. It is this authority that pagan governments appealed to when they wanted to seek advice from the oracle. It is also this authority that the church and the pope appealed to the Middle Ages, uh, um, the reason to stop. Middle Ages, opposing it to the private wills of feudal lords and kings. It was when a king proclaimed himself and claimed to represent this general will, beside his private will as king. This conflict between spiritual and secular power started. And it is only from the moment when the general will ceased to have a divine character, and or even an ideological one interpreted by the spiritual leader, that there came into being the idea according to which the general will is expressed through the will of the majority. This erroneous idea was abandoned as soon as another support for this general will was found in the proletariat of Lenin, Stalin, the imperial Mussolini, and the Volk of Hitler, and so on. So, in other words, the idea of the majority is a liberal idea in that sense. This is the idea of the general will, that the answer, how do we get to, what represents the general will? The majority represents the general will in this sense. Well, but then this throws away, this was reported immediately, the idea, this was ideological. This was an ideological understanding of this is the bourgeois mentality. And then what ended up happening here is this was abandoned by another one, right? The general will was founded in the proletariat. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And then the imperial Mussolini and the Volk and so on, right? In fact, the fact that the general will is therefore indisputable. The general will, the whole question hangs on knowing it is whether it is here a case of sui generis authority or some combination of our pure types of authority. But phenomenological analysis shows that the latter is indeed the case. Notebook. This question will be studied. Uh, this question must be studied more closely. The very notion of the general will, as well as the fact that, generally speaking, it has a tendency to assume the aspect of divine authority, shows that the latter claims a total authority and not a selective one, an authority that is absolute and not relative. In other words, it must integrate all forms of authority. Yet, let us then see whether it is something other than our combinations of the four pure types, or whether it involves them at all. It is obvious that one must start by looking at the elements of the authority of the master, given the whole, in so far as it is distinct from the sum of its parts. It is not a physical material reality. It cannot be a question of risking life in a struggle of death. The authority of the whole over parts, therefore, can never be that of a master over a slave. This ideally unreality of the whole also accounts for the fact that the general will has nothing to do with force, being only pure authority. But what, generally speaking, is the relationship of the whole to the parts? A mechanical whole is nothing other than the sum of total parts. As far as determining later, it's entirely determined by them. It is only in the living organism that it is possible to oppose the whole to its parts and say that in a certain sense the parts are subject to the whole and are determined by it as such. Compare Aristotle's notions of entity, which, as a matter of fact, has maintained all its values specificity in the study of biology, rather than, for instance, in physics and chemistry. Right? In other words, the intact. Um, okay, Aristotle's biology is still better. Kojeve's interesting. This Kojeve really points to Aristotle's biology here, saying it survives or his physics and chemistry doesn't, right? We cannot therefore speak of the authority of the whole over the parts except insofar as society or state is thought of, of analogous to an organism. It is therefore this analogy that must guide the phenomenological analysis of authority attributed to the general will. However, the biological idea of the whole is called upon to account for two things. One, hereditary, that is to say, the preeminence of structures of the organism, the chicken before the egg. And two, the harmony of the diverse elements of the organism. By contrast, the causality, finality of the whole, excludes the very kind of revolutionary modification of organism mutation. And in cases where the species, the whole, changes as a result of a change in one or several of its parts. We can therefore say that the whole determines the parts, whereas where there is harmony and permanence. But in every essential change, there is determination of the whole by its parts. So something that is changed, that is subject to change, is the whole. That the words the whole determines its parts is where there's harmony and permanence. But where there's but in every change there is determination of the whole by its parts. Very interesting point. By translating all of this into the authoritarian language, the language of authority, we can say that the authority of the general will is a combination of the authority of the father and judge, but it is never invested with the character of the authority of the leader. The leader, in effect, comes into being following a project he proposes. That is to say, according to a change, more or less radical, or even a projection in the given reality. Yeah, but the social contract is a change from chaos to order, right? Therefore, we have to distinguish between the general will versus the making of the general genesis of the general will. It is the leader of the authority, the creation of the general will of the body politic occurs when the social contract is created. Right? This creates the general will. The general will does not create the social contract. General contract. The social contract creates the general will. Before the general will, there's only individual wills. It is their coming together to form a body. That is the contract that creates the body politic, right? That's the Lockean, that's the Hobbes. I think even Rousseau even. So let's think about this. The leader is therefore affect the project. He to change more or less statical and projected than he given reality. This the authority that can only take the form of private will, the part. Okay. Even in Rousseau, reforms and innovations are carried out by the legislator, which clearly has the character of the individual. In principle, despite this, nothing contests the fact that it is a collective individual, whether a minority or a majority. But it is certainly not a whole against the parts. It is one of the parts set against the whole. By contrast, the authority of the father well expresses the hereditary aspect, the permanent side of the causality of the whole. And we can say the authority of the general will is that of the father type. It is the authority of the final cause. That is to say, that of the tradition, that of all that contributes to the preservation of the identity within itself. But given the fact that there is that, in fact, that it is here a question of the whole, That is to say, of several parts. The identity of the question is not unity, but of internal complex structure. In other words, this identity determines the harmony of the parts. But in the human or social political world, this harmony cannot be anything other than justice. The authority of the general will therefore be an authority of the father doubled with that of the judge, being the first being the base or the first authority, the base or the first authority. So the, the father is the first authority, the base, and the thing is the harmony. This is the organic structure. This is the thing that is organic, and therefore that is the thing that makes the structure, the harmony. In our list, this authority realizes therefore the type of FJ. So the general will is an FJ, right? That's the father judge. On the other hand, all this analysis shows that general will does not enjoy the benefits of any other sui generis authority except that of the father and judge. Now, if we move from the authority of the whole to that of the majority, we see that the element of the authority of the judge necessary disappears. The mere fact that a minority exists proves that the parts of the whole are not in harmony, and that this means that justice does not dominate the whole. Wherefore, whereas the majority appeals to the position as majority, even in relation with the minority, cannot do in the same as regard to the authority of the judge. If it does not enjoy the benefit of any other authority, it must call upon force alone. In other words, if it calls on force, there's no authority at all, right? So it needs to call on some authority. If it seems to have an authority qua majority, in reality, it has this authority only as representative of the authority of the whole, of the general will. But qua majority, which by definition does not encompass all citizens, cannot represent the element of the judge. It can therefore only appeal to the authority of the father. In other words, either there is no authority of the majority at all, or we can have a case of the authority of the father. In any event, there is no sui generis authority. This is indeed verified by experience. Insofar as the majority has authority derived from sheer numbers, it appears as guardian of tradition, or so on. Its authority is that of the Senate, of the censor, and so on. It is the authority of what the people say. All who voluntarily and constantly propose new things also ridicule the majority. And further, this majority loses its preeminence during revolutionary times when society decides it's time for a change. Now, let us move on to the question of transmission of authority. This transmission takes place through hereditary, election, and nomination. So therefore, there's three types. It's transmission is hereditary, election, or nomination. Let us look at hereditary transmission. In every transmission of authority, we assume, more or less consciously, that authority is not linked to a determined person. Hence, by the way, the possibility of collective authority. There was not one person, but a group of people. Since authority remains the same, the persons who represent it, embody, and realize it are thereby its material support, and so on. It can be replaced by another, which means the authority is not generated by the being of the person who possesses it, but only by his acts, or by his qualities, not by the substance, but by its attributions. If another person or persons were to act in the same way, they would enjoy the same benefits of the same authority. Therefore, authority can remain identical to itself while being transmitted from one person, individual, collective, to another, provided they all reproduce the acts that engender this authority. However, hereditary transmission is founded on a more or less conscious theory, according to which acts, more precisely virtues, or the possibilities of such acts, are transmitted from father to son. Hence, the idea that the son, or more generally speaking, a related person, inherits the authority of the father. To tell the truth, this theory of transition of authority is based on a very primitive and very magical way of thinking. Virtue equals possibility of the act is conceived as some sort of semi-material substance, the manna, which can be found more or less completely in all members of the same family and is transmitted in the fullest way from father to son, but not daughter. It decreases little by little. The younger son receives less of it than the elder, and so on. Later varieties of authorities of the divine order, divinity is um, transmitted preferably to the eldest son. And this materialist conception of authority, as this materialist authority came under attack, and indeed nothing suggests that the virtues that engender the authority are hereditary, this mode of transition lost much of its prestige. Nowadays, we consider it as almost non-existent. Far back in time, however, we find examples of the application of this mode of transmission of authority, even that of the judge. But now it seems that we want to reject it entirely. So hereditary is not really. In fact, that this mode of transmission of authority rests on an erroneous theory and therefore destined to disappear sooner or later. But all the types of authority that is against that of the father, that is the most prone to this tendency, is by its very nature, insofar as this authority has nothing to do than the authority of tradition. Right? No, the authority of the constitutional monarch is essentially reducible to that of the father. That is why, in this case, the hereditary transmission is managed to endure to this day without greatly shocking public opinion. It seems impossible to give back the head of state the authority of the leader, the judge, and thus also that of the master, by maintaining the principle of transmission of his authority by hereditary. The same remarks apply for the hereditary Senate, the House of Lords, for example, to the day of the Lords. There remain, therefore, two modes of transmission: election and nomination. So hereditary can't really have real authority. This is not going to be accepted. It's going to be only because of this thing of this. Not only the authority of the father can survive this, but or tradition can do this, but the real two things are election and nomination. At the first sight, these seem synonymous. Their company is saying that Athens, the magistrates were elected by the assembly of the people, whereas Cyrus the Great nominated his satraps. But we could as well say that the majority nominates the candidates, since it designates them without consulting anyone, without its will being limited by anyone, and that the dictator elects his collaborators, since he chooses those whom he thinks are best. In any case, whether it is a question of one or many, whether there is a vote or not, does not constitute the essential difference. The Roman triumvirs managed among themselves to put a candidate's seat to vote, but it was a nomination, not an election. And yet, when we speak of election, the nomination, it is certainly feels that if the two, we are using two distinct political categories. There is, there is, there is indeed, there is indeed a difference. We can make this visible by defining these notions in the following way. There is a transition of authority by nomination when the candidate of authority is designated by the person or persons who already possessed an authority, and when the same and one of the same types, a leader nominated by a leader, for example. There's a transition by election when the candidate is designated by a person or persons who either have no authority or have authority of another type, a judge nominated by a leader, for example. So therefore, the first type is nomination is the same type nominating someone to replace of the same type, or then someone of no authority or a different authority nominates someone of. Okay. In fact, the second case, there is generally election, that is to say, a choice of the best, since the candidate cannot derive his authority from the person who elected him. The latter not having any himself, so the candidate has only himself to thank for it. Mhm. If the election does not have other, the election does nothing other than to reveal his value, that to say, his authority. In this case, by contrast, the candidate can, in principle, be anyone, since he derives his authority from the person who has chosen him. The latter transmission to him of his connoisseurship is the form of in the form of guidelines, advices, and education, for example. Uh, Note one: strictly speaking, election does not differ uh, uh, in in essence from drawing lots. Okay, right? Election is not different from drawing lots. The individual or collective elector may well believe he is choosing the best, but if he has no authority, his choice has no value for the others. It is therefore, in their view, as if the candidate were being chosen by lot. Unless the elector has the negative authority, it is better to appoint judges by lot than to have them elected by thugs. It is the same for the elector who holds authority of a type different from the one being transmitted. In this case, he's incompetent. Therefore, direct universal suffrage and referendum do not differ from drawing lots. Woo! Direct universal suffrage and direct. Woo! Kojeve. In other words, election. In other words, Aristotle distinguishes election versus lots, and Aristotle argues that election is aristocratic and lots. But here, Kojeve says, therefore, direct universal suffrage and a referendum do not differ than drawing lots. That is a keeper. That is a keeper. Um, okay, I'm stuck with I did a highlight. I didn't mean to do a highlight. We have also seen that in the case of democracies of antiquity, election by vote have often come close to election by drawing lots. In a parliamentary regime, Parliament has inherited authority of the king. It therefore nominates those whom it appoints. The whole question comes down to knowing what is the nature of the authority of Parliament. If its members are elected by direct universal suffrage, this means they are chosen by lot. The election of the king has thus ceased to be transmitted by hereditary and is now transmitted by drawing lots. The whole question thus consists in knowing whether elements of this authority have managed to survive the change in this mode of transmission. Generally speaking, only the authority of the leader remains. The other three types disappear. Note 2. In the case of nomination, the nominator in other words, only the authority of the leader remains. Three types disappear, right? In this case of nomination, nominator can transmit in part his authority to the nominated without having his authority diminished. We can say that of the nominated is part of his own body, both acting as supportive to his authority, which remains the same. The loss of authority by the nominated is also considered a loss of the authority by the nominator. To make a particular mistake or to nominate someone who makes it is more or less the same thing. To nominate another person in place of one who has made it appear repeating oneself again. But the nominator can also transmit all of his authority to the nominated, as in nominating one's successor. Right? This is one way of doing it, right? Nomination. Note 3. If hereditary transmissions presupposes an erroneous theory, then transmission by election, that is to say, by drawing lots, is clearly unsatisfactory as well. Unless we call upon divine authority, the draw or election simply reveals God's nomination. Nomination thus remains as the only acceptable mode of transmission. But it is obvious that the spontaneous generous authority must always be preferable to any other form of transmission. The best would be to recognize the authority of the candidate who imposes himself, when it is the case of replacing one representative of an authority by another. Let us remind ourselves that the so-called elections are generally only external manifestations of spontaneous genesis. So this is elections, right? The main thing is to organize the electoral regime in such a way that it does not hinder these genesis. By its very essence, authority implies spontaneous generation. Any form of transmission of authority that diminishes it, of authority, always diminishes it to a certain extent. But if we consider the four pure types separately, we see that it is the authority of the judge that least lends itself to transmission. In order to have true authority, the judge represents must always have enjoyed the benefit of spontaneous authority founded on his personal justice, his honesty. Note, the random choice of jurors is a kind of spontaneous genesis of authority of the judge. Chosen at random, the jury is supposed to be impartial, that is to say, realize the virtue of justice, which is the founding of the authority of the judge. Also, its authority implies only to the case which has been chosen. That is to say, to the case which it is supposed to be just. As for the transmitted authority of the Father, we have always seen that it is best substituted to transmit, best suited to transmit by hereditary. Nomination comes next. That is to say, the designation of a holder of the same authority of the Father in the last place election. That is to say, drawing of lots. Right? In the last place, the election. That is to say, drawing of lots. So therefore, nomination, hereditary, that is drawing of the nomination comes next. Right? Father, nomination next, that is to say, and the election is last, right? The authority of the master, insofar as it can be transmitted, seems best to election. That is to say, random allocation, seeing that in the case of spontaneous generation of the authority of the victor, chance already played some role. Note, it is perhaps for this reason that tyrants tend to have their authority confirmed by referendums. Hereditary transmission is, by correct contrast, absolutely contrary to this type of authority, founded on personal risk, and hereditary mastery has always been founded on force and not on authority. Finally, the authority of the leader, insofar it has been transmitted, is best suited to nomination, understood as nominated by the person who possesses the authority of leader. Since the leader is supposed to predict the future, to succeed his project, he should suppose to know in advance the behavior of the person he nominates, in such a way that nomination by a recognized leader can, in principle, even transmit an authority other than that of the leader. In other words, insofar as there is no spontaneous generation authority, the extending authority always has a transience to be transmitted by way of nomination by a leader. But all of these questions have to be studied more closely. In other words, all of these issues have to be studied more closely. This is not a complete study in a sense. General note, all four types of these combinations can be realized in different spheres, political, religious, and so on. There is a religious sphere where there are supposedly relations between a beyond, a political sphere wherever there is a state. See brief article on the state, which is This reference is, albeit some will say, to the outline of phenomenology of right. Right. Also, is tyranny of wisdom. Right. Um, uh, the phenomenology of right. Oh my God, that's a. Whew. Um, so therefore, this is that the state, wherever there's the political sphere, is wherever there's a state. So religious sphere, wherever there's a beyond, transcendent. The political sphere is where there's a state. We have to see whether all types and combinations can be realized in all spheres. So therefore, can where can can all these types of religions? We have to see if all the different spheres of this relate here. So we're going to stop here. It's been long. This has been long. Next time we'll look at section 2, the metaphysical analysis. Well, if you have any comments or questions, please put them below, and I'll respond to them when I see them. If you like it, like the channel, like it, like things, share it with your friends, share it on social media. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. Let's grow the channel a little more. We're struggling around 300, so let's just grow. We have to grow. Another thing we have to do is now, if you didn't like it, you can thumb down it and say, I didn't like it. Well, I didn't like it. Say why you didn't like it, or talk that is something wrong, and say it. So we can learn from it. Last, you can follow me, and so if you want to follow me on social media, the links are below. Another thing you do, if you want to help, you want to give me, if you want to financially contribute to what I do here, help me do what I do. Please put you can do it through Subscribestar or Patreon down below, or other means. You can send me a check, whatever. But also you can buy one of my books that are listed below, and I help do. Okay, again, these posts are on Tuesdays. These little things, although separately, I do these on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on Monday, Tuesdays now resorting to something. I think we're doing Montesquieu Spirit of Laws. While I tape this Montesquieu, I'm doing Montesquieu on Mondays and Wednesdays, and that Fridays are usually, if not a live stream, and I'll be going live stream later. I'm not necessarily doing it right now. Then there is some other thing posting, some general thing. Well, that's it. I'll leave you alone now. That's it. We'll see you next time we continue this. Have a good day. Take care. Bye bye.